This podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
Now I will switch to English, and I have the pleasure and honor to introduce Robert Brandom to you. Robert Brandom is professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He earned his BA from Yale University and his PhD from Princeton University. In 1994, he published his famous book, Making It Explicit, followed in 2000 by a sort of shorter version, articulating reasons and introduction to inferentialism. Robert Brandom has also published a collection of essays on the history of philosophy, Tales of the Mighty Dead, 202. He delivered the 2006 John Locke lectures at Oxford University, and they have been published under the title Between Saying and Doing, Thoughts in Analytic Pragmatism, 2008. Allow me some further remarks. There is a distinction between an earlier and a later form of analytic philosophy, says Richard Rorty in his introduction to a new edition of Sellars' Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. The earlier form is a form of empiricism developed out of the work of Russell and Carnap. The later form is a, as Rorty puts it, post-positivistic form of analytic philosophy. To Rorty, the shift from the earlier to the later form is connected to the works of Quine, the later Wittgenstein, and Sellars. The general idea of this shift from the earlier to the later form is a critique of the myth of the given, to quote a famous expression of Sellars. What does this expression mean? Well, the history of philosophy is deeply influenced by the gap between world and mind, the gap between the real things and the not-so-real words, which refer somehow to reality. Whatever the world is, it's a given. Whatever the things are, they are given. On the other hand, our thoughts and words are not given, and this seems a disadvantage to our thoughts and words because it's the world which makes our thoughts true or false. The things of the world are the truth makers, but they are for themselves not true, but given. The gap between world and mind is the working place for numerous bridge builders. They want to bridge the gap in order to gain true knowledge of the world. But in the end, they discover that there is no possible bridge between the world and the mind because the gap is too deep, both sides are too different. Hegel calls this a result of a certain fear of truth. We fail to establish a bridge between world and mind because we want to fail. And the best way to guarantee the failure of all attempts is the myth of the given. Once the gap between a given world and a totally different mind is established, truth is impossible and skepticism the only option. Hegel is quite clear on this. To oppose skepticism, one must oppose the myth of the given. Robert Brandom, as I understand, stands in the tradition of this later form of analytic philosophy, especially in the Pittsburgh tradition of Sellars. Therefore, he opposes the gap between world and mind and claims, quote, that not only appearance, but also reality is conceptually articulated. In the old days, this claim was called idealism. For Hegel, idealism was true because it was the only way to defend realism. Is idealism the true realism? I think this is the very question. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the question of Robert Brandom as well. We are about to learn more about it. Dear Professor Brandom, I'm looking forward to your talk.
Hegel opens the first paragraph of the introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit by introducing a model of the cognitive faculties that he supposes will be most familiar to his readers in its Kantian form. He says, knowledge tends to be regarded as an instrument with which one takes hold of the absolute, or as the medium through which one discovers it. He thinks that no account of this general shape can meet basic epistemological criteria of adequacy. By showing that, he hopes to make his readers appreciate the need for an alternative model, which he will then supply. The general character of his complaint against construing cognitive faculties on the instrument or medium model seems clear enough. He offers a twofold summary. That model leads, first, to the conviction that there's an absurdity in the concept of even beginning a process of knowledge designed to gain for consciousness that which is in itself. And second, that there's a strict line of demarcation separating knowledge and the absolute. The first objection alleges that theories of the sort he is addressing must lead to a kind of skepticism, a failure to make intelligible the idea of knowing how things are in themselves. The second complaint points to a diagnosis of a reason for this failure. The model excavates a gulf separating consciousness from what it's consciousness of, what Professor Hutter was just talking about under the heading of the myth of the given. Hegel expands on both these points. He fills in the charge that instrument or medium theories lead to skepticism by saying, quote, if knowledge is the instrument to take hold of the absolute essence, one is immediately reminded that the application of an instrument to a thing does not leave it as it is, but brings about a shaping and an alteration of it. Or, if knowledge is not an instrument for our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again we do not receive this truth as it is in itself, but as it is in and through this medium. In both cases, we employ a means which immediately brings about the opposite of its own end, or rather the absurdity lies in our making use of any means at all. End of the quote. In either case, there's going to be a distinction between what things are for consciousness, the product of the exercise of cognitive faculties, and what they are in themselves, the raw materials on which those cognitive faculties are exercised. Something about the character of this distinction, Hegel seems to be arguing, is incompatible with what things are for consciousness, according to such a picture, counting as genuine knowledge of how things really are in themselves. He elaborates the problem that was diagnosed in the passage I just read. It is that the instrument or medium picture, quote, presupposes notions about knowledge as an instrument and a medium, and also the notion that there's a difference between ourselves and this knowledge. But above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side, and knowledge, though it is on the other side for itself and separated from the absolute, is nonetheless something real. Hence it assumes that knowledge may be true despite its presupposition that knowledge is outside the absolute, and therewith outside the truth as well. By taking this position, what calls itself the fear of error reveals itself as the fear of truth. Another famous passage that Professor Hutter repeated. It's apparently of the essence of this instrument or medium model to see such a difference, a separation, two sides of one divide, and to understand the job of the cognitive faculties to consist in bridging that divide. The argument here seems to be that if there's a gulf separating how things are in themselves from how they are for consciousness, that requires the operation of cognitive faculties to bridge it or reunite the two sides, then all that investigation of those faculties can do is reinstitute the gulf or the separation. I think we can see in these passages the general shape of an argument, but it's hazy, and it's hard to discern both the exact outlines of the class of views that it targets and just how the criticism of them is supposed to work. The haziness of the arguments, I think, is due partly to the compression of the exposition and partly to the metaphorical terms in which it's conducted. To fill in the details, one would have to specify what criteria of adequacy for epistemological theories Hegel is insisting on. What class of theories exactly he claims cannot satisfy those criteria, and what features of those theories are responsible for that failure, and how exactly the argument for that conclusion works. In the rest of this lecture, I offer one way of sharpening the argument that Hegel is putting on the table here along these four dimensions, and also an initial characterization of the shape of the alternative model that Hegel proposes to replace the instrument or medium model. To get a better specification of the range of epistemological theories that fall within the target area of Hegel's argument, what he's metaphorically labeled as the instrument or medium model, it'll help to begin a little further back. The theories he's addressing are representational theories of the relation between appearance and reality. Representation is a distinctively modern concept. In order to understand how strings of algebraic symbols could be useful, veridical, tractable appearances of geometrical realities, Descartes needed a new way of conceiving the relations between appearance and reality. His philosophical response to the scientific and mathematical advances in understanding of this intellectually turbulent and exciting time was the development of a concept of representation that was much more abstract, powerful, and flexible than the resemblance model of the ancients and the medievals that it supplanted. He saw that what made algebraic understanding of geometrical figures possible was a global isomorphism between the whole system of algebraic symbols and the whole system of geometrical figures. That isomorphism defined a notion of form that was shared by the licit manipulation of strings of algebraic symbols and the constructions possible with geometrical figures. In the context of such an isomorphism, the particular material properties of what now become intelligible as representings and representeds become irrelevant to the semantic relation between them. All that matters is the correlation between the rules governing the manipulation of the representings and the actual possibilities that characterize the representeds. Inspired by the new emerging forms of modern scientific understanding, Descartes concluded that this representational relation, of which the ancient notion of resemblance then appears merely as a primitive species, is the key to understanding the relations between mind and world, appearance and reality, quite generally. This was a fabulous tradition-transforming idea, and everything Western philosophers have thought since, no less on the practical and on the theoretical side, is downstream from it, conceptually, and not just temporally. But Descartes combined this idea with another, more problematic one. This is the idea that if any things are to be known or understood representationally, whether correctly or not, by being represented, then there must be some things that are known or understood non-representationally, immediately, not by means of the mediation of representings. If representings themselves could only be known representationally, by being themselves in turn represented, then a vicious infinite regress would result. For we would only be able to know about a represented thing by knowing about a representing of it, and could only count on knowing about it if we already knew about a representing of it, and so on. In a formulation that was only extracted explicitly centuries later by Josiah Royce, if even error, misrepresentation, never mind knowledge, is to be possible, then Descartes thought there must be something about which error is not possible, something we know about not by representing it, so that error in the sense of misrepresentation is possible. If we can know or be wrong about anything representationally by means of the medium of representings of it, there must be some representings that we grasp, understand, or know about immediately, simply by having them. The result was a two-stage representational theory that sharply distinguished between two kinds of things based on their intrinsic intelligibility. Some things, paradigmatically physical, material, extended things, can by their nature only be known by being represented. Other things, the contents of our own minds, are by nature representings and are known in another way entirely. They're known immediately, not by being represented, but just by being had. They're intrinsically intelligible, in that their mere matter-of-factual occurrence counts as knowing or understanding something. Things that are by nature knowable only as represented are not in this sense intrinsically intelligible. Their occurrence does not by itself entail that anyone knows or understands anything. As I've indicated, I think Descartes was driven to this picture by two demands. On the one hand, making sense of the new theoretical, mathematized scientific forms in which reality could appear, the best and most efficacious forms of understanding of his time, required a new, more abstract notion of representation. And the idea that it is by an appropriate way of representing things that we know and understand them best. So we must distinguish between representings and representeds and worry about the relations between them, in virtue of which manipulating the one sort of thing counts as knowing or understanding the other. On the other hand, such a two-stage model is threatened with unintelligibility in the form of a looming infinite regress of explanation if we don't distinguish between how we know representeds, by means of our relations to representings of them, and how we know at least some representings immediately, at least not by being related to representings of them. The result was a two-stage model in which we're immediately related to representings, and in virtue of their relation to represented, stand in a mediated cognitive relation to those represented things. The representings must be understood as intrinsically and immediately intelligible, and the representeds as only intelligible in a derivative, compositional sense, as the result of the product of our immediate relation to representings and their relation to representeds. I want to say that it's this epistemological model that Hegel takes as his target in his opening remarks in the introduction to the Phenomenology. What he's objecting to is a two-stage representational theory that are committed to a fundamental difference in intelligibility between appearances, representings, how things are for consciousness, and reality, the representeds, how things are in themselves, according to which the former are immediately and intrinsically intelligible, and the latter are not. What Hegel talks about is the gulf, the difference, the separation, the two sides of one divide separating appearance and reality, knowing and the known, that he complains about, is just this gulf of intelligibility. His critical claim is that any theory of this form is doomed to yield skeptical results. Of course, Descartes' view is not the only one that Hegel means to be criticizing. Kant, too, has a two-stage representational theory. Cognitive activity needs to be understood as the product of both the mind's activities of manipulating representations, in the sense of representings, and the relations those representings stand in to what they represent. Both what the mind does with its representations and how they're related to what they represent must be considered in apportioning responsibility for features of those representings to the things represented, as specified in a vocabulary that does not invoke either the mind's manipulation of representations or the relations between representings and representeds. That is, things as they are, as Kant taught us to say, in themselves, an sich, or to the representational relations and what the cognitive faculties do with and to representings. The latter, for Kant, yields what the represented things are for consciousness. In Hegel's terminology, contentful representings. Kant's theory, to be sure, is not the same as Descartes', but it shares the two-stage representational structure that distinguishes the mind's relations to its representings and its relation to representeds that's mediated by those representings. Although Kant does sometimes seem to think that we have a special kind of access to the products of our own cognitive activity, He does not think of our awareness of representings as immediate in any recognizably Cartesian sense. For him, awareness is apperception, and the minimal unit of apperception is judgment. To judge, for Kant, is to integrate a conceptually articulated content into a constellation of commitments exhibiting the distinctive synthetic unity of apperception. Doing that is extruding from the constellation of commitments incompatible with the judgment being made and extracting from it inferential consequences that are then added to that constellation of commitments. This is a process that's mediated by the relations of material incompatibility and consequence that relate the concepts being applied in the judgments to the concepts applied in other possible judgments. So Kant shares with Descartes the two-stage representational structure, but he does not take over the view that our relation to our own representations is one of immediate awareness. Still, his view falls within the range of Hegel's criticisms, because he maintains the differential intelligibility of representings and representeds. Representings as such are intelligible, and what's represented is, as such, not. I'll call this a commitment to a strong differential intelligibility of appearance and reality, the claim that the one is the right sort of thing to be intelligible, and the other is not. Kant gives us a new model of intelligibility. To be intelligible is to have a content articulated by concepts. It's the concepts applied in an act of awareness, apperception, that determine what would count as successfully integrating that judgment into a whole exhibiting the distinctive synthetic unity of apperception. But the conceptual articulation of judgments is a form contributed by the cognitive faculty of the understanding. It's not something we can know or assume to characterize what's represented by those conceptual representings, as they are in themselves. On Hegel's reading, Kant is committed to a gulf of intelligibility, separating our representings from what they are representings of, in the form of the view that the representings are in conceptual shape, and what's represented, the way things are in themselves, is not. Just to remind ourselves how much is at stake in Hegel's criticism of two-stage representational theories of the relations between appearance and reality that are committed to the differential intelligibility of the relata, it's worth thinking in this connection also about Frege. For Frege, discursive symbols express a sense, Sinn, and thereby designate a referent, Bedeutung. Senses are what is grasped when one understands the expression, and referents are what is thereby represented, what expressing that sense is talking or thinking about. A sense is a representing in that it's what he calls a mode of presentation, out des Gegebenseins, of a referent. No more than Kant does Frege construe grasp of a sense as immediate in a Cartesian sense, according to which the mere occurrence of something with that sense counts as the mind knowing or understanding something. Rather, grasping a judgeable content requires mastering the inferential and substitutional relations that sense stands in to other contents. But like Descartes and Kant, Frege thinks that grasping senses, understanding representations as representations, does not require representing them in turn, and that representings in the sense of senses are graspable in a sense in which what they represent is not. So if, as I've claimed, Hegel's argument is intended to be directed at two-stage representational models committed to treating representations as intelligible in a sense in which representeds are not, then it seems that Fregean sense reference theories, as well as Kantian and Cartesian versions, will be among the targets of Hegel's argument. Now, in order to see whether there is an argument of the sort Hegel is after that tells against theories of this kind, two-stage representational theories committed to the strong differential intelligibility of representings and representeds, we must next think about what criteria of adequacy for such theories Hegel is appealing to. In general, we know what Hegel thinks is wrong with them is that they lead to skepticism. Further, he tells us that what he means by this is that such theories preclude knowing things as they are in themselves. I think what's going on here is that Hegel learned from Kant that the soft underbelly of epistemological theories is the semantic theories that they implicitly incorporate and depend upon. And he thinks that two-stage representational theories, committed to the strong differential intelligibility of representings and what they represent, semantically preclude genuine knowledge of those representeds. I'll call the criterion of adequacy on epistemological theories that Hegel's implicitly invoking here the genuine knowledge condition, GKC. Obviously, a lot's going to turn on what counts as genuine knowledge. But it's clear in any case that this requirement demands that an epistemological theory not be committed to a semantics, in particular to a theory of representation, that when looked at closely turns out to rule out as unintelligible the very possibility of knowing how things really are, genuine knowledge. I do not take it that the very existence of a contrast between how we know what's represented and how we know representings by itself demonstrates such a failure. Hegel's specific claim is that when that difference is construed as one of intelligibility, in the strong sense, representings are intrinsically intelligible and representeds are not, then skepticism about genuine knowledge is a consequence. And he takes from Kant the idea that intelligibility is a matter of conceptual articulation. To be intelligible is to be in conceptual shape. If this reading is correct, then Hegel's argument must show that to satisfy the genuine knowledge condition, an epistemological theory must treat not only appearance, how things subjectively are for consciousness, but also reality, how things objectively are in themselves as conceptually articulated. Again, what could count as a good argument for this claim obviously turns on what's required to satisfy that requirement. Both resemblance and representation models of the relations between appearance and reality have a story about what error consists in. This is what happens when, on the resemblance picture, antecedently intelligible properties are not shared, so that resemblance breaks down. Or when there are local breakdowns in the globally defined isomorphism between the systems of representings and representeds. In the middle paragraphs of the introduction, in which Hegel begins to present his alternative to two-stage representational epistemological theories committed to strong differential intelligibility of representings and representeds, the treatment of error looms large. I think we can take it as an implicit criterion of adequacy that Hegel is imposing on epistemological theories, that they make intelligible also the phenomenon, not just of genuine knowledge, but also of error. I'll call this the intelligibility of error condition. The genuine knowledge condition and the intelligibility of error condition are epistemological constraints. The semantics presupposed by or implicit in an epistemological theory must, Hegel is telling us, not preclude the intelligibility either of genuine knowledge or of error, being wrong about how things really are. We must be able to understand both what it is for what there is to appear as it is and for it to appear as it is not. An epistemological theory that does not make both of these intelligible is not adequate to the phenomenon of our efforts to know and understand how things really are. But approaching epistemology, as Kant suggests, from this semantic direction, suggests that behind these epistemological constraints are deeper semantic ones. I think that is in fact the case here. We can't read these off of Hegel's extremely telegraphic remarks in the text of the opening paragraphs of the introduction, but must infer them from the solution he ultimately proposes to the challenges that he sets out there. First is what we could call, looking over our shoulders at Frege, the mode of presentation condition. This is the requirement that appearances, senses, representings, must be essentially, and not just accidentally, appearances of some purported realities. One does not count as properly having grasped an appearing unless one grasps it as the appearance of something. When all goes well, grasping the appearance must count as a way of knowing about what it is an appearance of. Appearances must make some sort of reality semantically visible or otherwise accessible. The claim is not that one ought not to reify appearances, think of them as things, but rather, for instance, adverbially, in terms of being appeared to solely. That's not a silly thought, but it's not the present point. The present idea is that if the epistemological genuine knowledge condition is to be satisfied by a two-stage representational model, representings must be semantic presentations of representeds in a robust sense, in which what one has grasped is not a representation unless it's grasped as a representation of some represented. Further along, we'll see how Hegel, again following Kant, understands this requirement. Taking or treating something in practice as a representing is taking or treating it as subject to a distinctive kind of normative assessment as to its correctness, in a way in which what thereby counts as represented serves as the standard for normative assessment of correctness. A second semantic constraint on epistemological theories that I take to be implicitly in play in Hegel's understanding of the epistemological genuine knowledge condition is that if the representational relation is to be understood semantically in a way that can support genuine knowledge, it must portray what's represented as exerting rational constraint on representings of it. That is, how it is with what's represented must, when the representation relation is not defective, provide a reason for the representing to be as it is. What we're talking or thinking about must be able to provide reasons for what we say or think about it. We can call this the rational constraint condition. Though he doesn't argue for this constraint in the introduction, I think in many ways it's the key premise for the argument that Hegel does offer. The thought is that the difference between merely responding differentially to the presence or absence of a fact or property, on the one hand, and comprehending it, having thoughts that are about it, in the sense that counts as knowledge if everything goes well, depends on the possibility of that fact or property being able to serve for the knower as a reason for having a belief or making a commitment. The central sort of semantic aboutness depends on being able rationally to take in how things are, in the sense of taking them in as providing reasons for our attitudes. Those of you who are familiar with the work of my colleague John McDowell will hear resonances in this language. Hegel learns from Kant to think about representation in normative terms. What's represented exercises a distinctive kind of authority over representings. Representings are normatively responsible to what they represent. What's represented serves as a kind of authoritative normative standard for assessments of the correctness of what count as representings of it, whether correct or incorrect, just in virtue of being subject to assessments of their correctness in which those representeds provide the standard. The rational constraint condition adds that the standard, what's represented, must provide reasons for those normative assessments. In fact, in the context of Kant's and Hegel's views, this is not a further commitment, for neither of them distinguishes between norms or rules, on the one hand, and norms or rules that are rational in the sense of being conceptually articulated, on the other. All norms are, for them, understood as conceptual norms. Norms, or rules, and concepts are just two ways of thinking about the same thing. Conceptual norms are norms that determine what's a reason for what. For a norm to be contentful is for it to have conceptual content, a matter of what it can be a reason for or against, and what can be a reason for or against it. That's just the only kind of content they acknowledge. The German idealists are rationalists about norms in that norms or rules are contentful exclusively in the sense of being conceptually contentful. The rational constraint condition accordingly fills in the sense of representation or aboutness on which the mode of presentation condition depends. And these two semantic conditions provide the crucial criteria of adequacy for satisfying the two epistemological conditions, the genuine knowledge condition and the intelligibility of error condition. For the intelligibility of genuine knowledge of, or error about how things really are, turns on the rational normative constraint those realities exert on what counts as appearances or representings of those realities, just insofar as the representings are subject to normative assessment of correctness and incorrectness, knowledge and error, in which those realities serve as the standard, in the sense of providing reasons for those assessments. Well, supposing that those four conditions, two epistemological and two semantic, represent the relevant criteria of adequacy for epistemological theories and their implicit semantics, what in the end is the argument against two-stage representational theories that are committed to a strong difference of intelligibility between representings and representeds, appearance and reality? Why can't theories of this form in principle satisfy the four criteria of adequacy? It's characteristic of two-stage theories, not just Descartes, but also those of Kant and Frege, that they incorporate a distinction between two ways of knowing or understanding things. Some things are known only representationally, by being represented. Other things, at least some representings, according to the regress argument, are known non-representationally, in some way other than by being represented. If we're interested in investigating cognitive faculties in the context of theories like this, we're interested, in the end, in semantics, in the representation relation. For the cognitive faculties are the instrument or medium that produces representings of the real. But then we must ask, is the representational relation, the relation between representings and what they represent, itself something that is known representationally, or is it something that can be known non-representationally? If it's self something that's knowable or intelligible only by being represented, it seems that we're embarked on a vicious Bradleyan regress, a successor to the one Descartes was worried about. The epistemological enterprise is not intelligible unless we can semantically make sense of the relation between representations, of representational relations and those representational relations, and then representations of those relations, and so on. Until we've grasped all of that infinite chain of representings of representings of representings, we're not in a position to understand the representational relation, and hence not the instrument or medium of representation. Semantic skepticism, skepticism about what it is so much as to purport to represent something, must then be the result. This argument is essentially the Cartesian regress of representation argument for non-representational knowledge of representings, but applied now not just to the representings, but to the relation they stand in to what they represent. So, on this argument, if epistemology, and so knowledge, is to be intelligible, it seems that within this sort of framework we must embrace the other horn of the dilemma, and take it that the representation relation is something that can itself be known or understood non- or pre-representationally, that in this respect it belongs in a box with the representations or appearances themselves. Responding in this way to the dilemma concerning our understanding of the representation relation is, in effect, acknowledging the mode of presentation condition. For it's saying that part of our non-representational understanding of appearances, representings, must be understanding them as appearances, as representings of something. Their representational properties, their ofness, their relation to what they at least purport to represent, must be intelligible in the same sense in which the representings themselves are. And the rational constraint condition says that for appearances to be intelligible as appearances, representings, modes of appearance, modes of presentation of something, they must be intelligible as rationally constrained by what they then count as representing. This means that what's represented must be intelligible as providing reasons for assessments of correctness and incorrectness of appearances and representings. Reasons are things that can be thought and said, cited as reasons, for instance, for an assessment of a representation as correct or incorrect, as amounting to knowledge or error. And that's to say that what provides reasons for such assessments must itself, no less than the assessments themselves, be in conceptual form. Giving reasons for undertaking a commitment, for instance to an assessment of correctness or incorrectness, is endorsing a sample piece of reasoning, an inference, in which the premises provide good reasons for the commitment. It's to exhibit premises the endorsement of which entitles one to the conclusion. So, the reasons, no less than what they're reasons for, must be conceptually articulated. Put another way, appearances are to be intelligible, graspable, in the sense that they are conceptually articulated. Understanding the judgment that things are thus and so requires knowing what concepts are being applied and understanding those concepts. One only does that insofar as one practically masters their role in reasoning, what their applicability provides reasons for and against, and the applicability of what other concepts would provide reasons for or against their applicability. If the relation between appearances and the realities they're appearances of, what they represent, how they represent things as being, thus and so, is to be intelligible in the same sense that the appearances themselves are, so that the regress of representation is avoided, this must be because that relation itself is a conceptual relation, a relation among concepts or concept applications, a relation between things that are conceptually articulated. The conclusion is that if the rational constraint condition must be satisfied in order to satisfy the genuine knowledge condition and the intelligibility of error condition, if the rational constraint condition really is a semantically necessary condition on satisfying those epistemological criteria of adequacy, perhaps because it's a necessary condition of satisfying the mode of presentation condition, which itself is a necessary semantic condition on satisfying the epistemological genuine knowledge condition and the intelligibility of error condition, then those conditions cannot be satisfied by a two-stage representational theory that's committed to the strong differential intelligibility of representing and represented. If not only representings, but the representation relation must be intelligible in a sense that requires their conceptual articulation, then both ends of the representation relation must be conceptually contentful. Only in that way is it intelligible how what's represented can exert rational constraint on representings in the sense of providing reasons for assessments of their correctness or incorrectness. Now, what I want to do in the rest of my talk today is begin to introduce the alternative shape of theory that Hegel is going to recommend to us. So far, I've been working to find structure beneath what appears on the telegraphic surface of the text of the opening paragraphs of Hegel's introduction. I claim so far only to have sketched a potentially colorable argument. Further exploration is required of the reasons for accepting the rational constraint condition, which this exposition reveals as the principal load-bearing premise of that argument. A key component of that enterprise would be clarifying the concepts of conceptual articulation and conceptual content. What the rational constraint condition says must characterize both the representing and the represented, which commitment to a representational theory with a strong difference of intelligibility denies. It'll help to begin on this latter task by looking at what sort of theories might be thought to be available once the strong difference of intelligibility of appearance and reality has been denied. That is, once one is committed to not excavating a gulf of intelligibility between representings and what they represent, between appearance and reality, between mind and world. One place to begin is with Frege's proposed definition in The Thought. He says, a fact is a thought that is true. Thoughts for Frege are the senses of declarative sentences. They're claims in the sense of claimable contents rather than claimings. A fact, he's saying, is not something that corresponds to or is represented by such a sense. It just is such a sense that is true. Facts for Frege are a subset of claimables, senses, representings, cognitive appearings. Of course, Frege retains the two-stage representational model for the relation between senses and their reference, for thoughts, truth values. And this matters for what he thinks senses are, namely modes of presentation of reference. But as far as the relations between thoughts and facts are concerned, he doesn't appeal to such a model. Again, Wittgenstein says, in what is possibly John McDowell's favorite quotation from the Investigations, quote, when we say and mean that such and such is the case, we and our meaning do not stop anywhere short of the fact. But we mean this is so, end of the quote. In these cases, the content of what we say, our meaning, is the fact. Such an approach is sometimes talked about under the title of an identity theory of truth, and it's sometimes attributed under that rubric to John McDowell, though that's not the way he would put it. On such an approach, there is no principled gulf of intelligibility between appearance and reality, because, at least when all goes well, the appearances inherit their content from the reality that they are appearances of. Thoughts, in the sense of thinkings, can share their content with true thoughts, in the sense of thinkables, that are the facts they represent. Representings are distinct from representeds, so the two-stage representational model is still endorsed, but they're understood as two forms in which one content can be manifested. What's most striking, I think, about views of this stripe is that they're committed to the claim that, as McDowell puts it in Mind and World, the conceptual has no outer boundary. What is thinkable is identified with what's conceptually contentful. But the objective facts, no less than the subjective thinkings and claimings about them, are understood as themselves already in conceptual shape. The early Wittgenstein, no less than the later, thought of things this way when he said, "The world is everything that is the case, the totality of facts." And what is the case can be said of it. Facts are essentially, and not just accidentally, things that can be stated and thought. Views with these consequences provide a very friendly environment in which to satisfy the rational constraint condition. And so, in the context of a suitable Kantian normative understanding of aboutness, the mode of presentation condition on understandings of the relation between cognitive appearances and the realities of which they are appearances. Now, the defensibility and plausibility of this sort of approach depend principally on the details of the understanding of the meta-concept of the conceptual contentfulness, conceptual articulation, in terms of which it's explicated. For in some such conceptions, it's extremely implausible, perhaps indefensible. For instance, if one's understanding of concepts is ultimately psychological, then the idea that thoughts, thinkings, believings, and facts might have the same conceptual content would have undesirable consequences. If one thinks that what is in the first instance conceptually contentful is beliefs and thoughts, and that other things such as visual and auditory sign designs, marks and noises, can count as conceptually contentful only at one remove, by being expressions of beliefs and thoughts, then the claim that the facts those beliefs and thoughts, and derivatively the marks and noises express, when all goes well, are themselves conceptually contentful, that thought threatens to make the existence of those facts, including ones that will never be expressed or represented, objectionably dependent on the existence of thinkings and believings. The same unfortunate sort of implication results from conjoining the rational constraint version of the mode of presentation constraint with Davidson's claim that only a belief can justify a belief. Berkeley claims that the only things we can intelligibly be understood to represent by our thoughts are other thoughts, the thoughts of God. Some of the British idealists thought that the reality that appeared to us in thought and belief consisted of the thought of the absolute, and thought they had learned that lesson from Hegel. More recently, Derrida, using de Saussure's conceptually pre-Kantian and pre-Fregean terminology, offers a picture of a world consisting only of signifiers, with the only things available to be signified being further signifiers. At this point, things have clearly gone badly wrong. If Hegel's opening argument has to be filled in a way that has this sort of idealism as its consequence, we ought to exploit it by modus tollens, not by modus ponens. In fact, though Hegel's idea is that the criteria of adequacy for accounts of the relations between appearance and reality that underlie his argument can be satisfied without untoward consequences, but only in the context of a different, wholly non-psychological conception of conceptual contentfulness. The kind of idealism that would require a world thinker on the objective side, no less than a finite thinker on the subjective side, is indeed, for Hegel as for us, a reductio ad absurdum. But what it should lead us to reject is not the claim that two-stage representational theories must avoid making strong distinctions of intelligibility between representings and representeds, because then they can't satisfy the semantic rational constraint condition and mode of presentation condition, and so not the epistemological genuine knowledge condition and intelligibility of error condition either, what we should reject is the particular conception of conceptual articulation and hence intelligibility with which they've been conjoined. Hegel gets his concept of conceptual content from thinking about Kant's theory of judgment and taking on board Kant's understanding of concepts as functions of judgment. Kant understands judging in normative and pragmatic terms. On the normative side, he understands judging as committing oneself, taking responsibility for something, endorsing the judged content. On the pragmatic side, he understands those normative doings in practical terms, as a matter of what one is committed or responsible for doing. What one is responsible for doing is integrating the endorsed content into a constellation of other commitments that exhibits the distinctive unity of apperception. Doing that, synthesizing the unity, is extruding from the dynamically evolving unity commitments that are materially incompatible with the new commitment, and extracting and endorsing, so adding commitments that are its material consequences. Judging that P, for Kant, is committing oneself to integrating P with what one is already committed to, synthesizing a new constellation exhibiting that rational unity characteristic of perception, of apperception. From Hegel's point of view, that extrusion or expulsion of incompatible commitments and extraction and expansion according to consequential commitments is the inhalation and exhalation, the breathing rhythm by which a rational subject lives and develops. Synthesizing a normative subject, which must exhibit the synthetic unity distinctive of apperception, is a rational process, because if one judgment is materially incompatible with another, it serves as a reason against endorsing the other. And if one judgment has another as its material inferential consequence, it serves as a reason for endorsing that other. Understanding the activity of judging in terms of synthesis by integration into a rational unity of apperception requires that judgeable contents stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility and consequence. For it's such relations that normatively constrain the apperceptive process of synthesis, determining what counts as a proper or successful fulfilling of the judging subject's integrative task responsibility or commitment. Concepts, as functions of judgment, determine what counts as a reason for or against their applicability, and what their applicability counts as a reason for or against. Since this is true of all concepts, not just formal or logical ones, the incompatibility and inferential consequence relations the concepts determine must in general be understood as material, that is, as having to do with the non-logical contents of the concepts, not just as logical, having to do with their logical form. Well, I've introduced the idea of conceptual content as articulated by relations of material incompatibility and consequence in Kantian terms, of the norms such contents impose on the process of judgment as rational integration. They're providing standards for the normative assessment of such integration as correct or successful, settling what one has committed oneself to do or made oneself responsible for doing in endorsing a judgeable content. But I also said that Hegel's notion of conceptual content is not a psychological one. One could mean by that claim that what articulates conceptual content is normative relations, a matter of what one ought to do, rather than something that can be read immediately off of what one actually does or is disposed to do. That distinction is indeed of the essence for Kant and further for Hegel. But in Hegel's hands, this approach to conceptual content shows itself to be non-psychological in a much more robust sense. For he sees that it characterizes not only the process of thinking on the subjective side of the intentional nexus, but also what is thought about on the objective side. For objective properties, and so the facts concerning which objects exhibit which properties, also stand in relations of material incompatibility and consequence. Natural science, paradigmatically Newton's physics, reveals objective properties and facts as standing to one another in lawful relations of exclusion and consequence. The two bodies subject to no other forces collide as materially, non-logically, because of the laws of nature, incompatible with their accelerations not changing. That the acceleration of a massive object is changed has as a material consequence, it lawfully necessitates that a force has been applied to it. In the first case, the two ways the world could be do not just contrast with one another, they don't just differ. It's impossible, so Newtonian physics tells us, not logic. It's physically impossible that both should be facts. And in the second case, it's physically necessary, a matter of the laws of physics, that if a fact of the first kind were to obtain, so would a fact of the second kind. It follows that if by conceptual we mean with Hegel standing in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, then the objective facts and properties natural science reveals to us as physical reality are themselves in conceptual shape. Modal realism, the claim that some states of affairs necessitate others and make others impossible, the acknowledgement of laws of nature, entails conceptual realism in this sense, the claim that the way the world objectively is conceptually articulated. This is a non-psychological conception of the conceptual in a robust sense, because having conceptual content standing in relations of material incompatibility and consequence does not require anyone to think or believe anything. If Newton's laws are true, then they held before there were thinkers, and would hold even if there never were thinkers. The facts governed by those laws, for instance, early collisions of particles, stood in lawful relations of relative impossibility and necessity to other possible facts, and hence, on this conception of the conceptual, had conceptual content quite independently of whether any subjective processes of thinking had gone on, were going on, or ever would go on in this or any other possible world. Hegel thinks that underlying this point about the conceptual character of objective reality is a deeper one. For he thinks that the idea of determinateness itself is to be understood in terms of standing in relations of incompatibility and consequence to other things that are determinate in the same sense. He endorses Spinoza's principle, omnis determinatio est negatio. For something to be determinate is for it to be one way rather than some other way. This thought is incorporated in the 20th century concept of information, due to Shannon, which understands information in terms of the partition each bit establishes between how things are, according to the information, and how they're not. Everyone should agree that if a property does not contrast with any properties, if it's not even different from any of them, then it's just indeterminate. To know that an object had such a property would be to know nothing about it. Beginning already in the perception chapter of the Phenomenology, Hegel argues that determinateness requires more than mere difference from other things. It requires what he calls exclusive, ausschließend difference, and not mere or indifferent, gleichgültig difference. The properties square and circular are exclusively different properties, since possession by a plane figure of the one excludes, rules out, or is materially incompatible with possession of the other. The properties square and green are merely or indifferently different, in that though they are distinct properties, possession of the one does not preclude possession of the other. An essential part of the determinate content of a property, what makes it the property that it is and not some other, is the relations of material, modally robust incompatibility it stands in to other determinate properties. For instance, shapes to other shapes, colors to other colors. We can make sense of the idea of merely different properties, such as square and green, only in a context in which they come in families of shapes and colors whose members are exclusively different from one another. An important argument for understanding determinateness Hegel's way, in terms of exclusive difference or material incompatibility, and one that he pursues in the perception chapter, is that that's what's required to underwrite an essential aspect of the structural difference between the fundamental ontological categories of object and property, particular and universal. Aristotle had already pointed out a structural asymmetry between these categories. It makes sense to think of each property as coming with a converse, in the sense of a property that's exhibited by all and only the objects that do not exhibit the index property. Has a mass greater than 5 grams is a property that has a converse in this sense. But it does not make sense to think of objects as coming with converses, in the analogous sense of an object that exhibits all and only the properties that are not exhibited by the index object. This is precisely because some of those properties will be incompatible with one another and so cannot be exhibited by a single object. The number 9 has the properties of being a number, of not being prime, being odd, and not being divisible by 5. If it had a converse, that object would have to have the properties of not being a number, of being prime, being even, and being divisible by 5. But nothing can have all of those properties. It follows that a world that's categorically determinate, in that it includes determinate properties and objects, and so facts, must be determinate in Hegel's sense. The properties must stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility. If they do that, they'll also stand to one another in relations of material consequence, since a property P will have the property Q as a consequence if everything incompatible with Q is incompatible with P. So being a bear has being a vertebrate as a consequence, since everything incompatible with being a vertebrate, for instance being a prime number, is incompatible with being a bear. Since Hegel understands being conceptually contentful as standing to other such items in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, to take the objective world to be minimally determinate in the sense of consisting of facts about what objects have what properties, that is to take the world to be conceptually structured in his sense. For him, only conceptual realists are entitled to think of objective reality as so much as determinate. Modal realism pretty much comes for free. We didn't need Newtonian physics to get to conceptual realism in this sense. The barest Aristotelian metaphysics is already enough. This is the conception of the conceptual at the core of Hegel's thought that is non-psychological in a very strong sense. And in this sense, there's no problem with seeing both sides of the appearance-reality distinction as conceptually structured. We're not, on that account, obliged to excavate a gulf of intelligibility between them. And for the same reason, the principal obstacle to satisfying the rational constraint condition, and therefore the mode of presentation condition, is removed. Though I haven't yet said anything positive about how they might be satisfied either, that's the topic of my next lecture. But that means, in turn, that the semantic presuppositions that I've been reading Hegel as taking it to make it impossible to satisfy the epistemological criteria of adequacy expressed by the genuine knowledge condition and the intelligibility of error condition can also be avoided. Access to all of these desirable consequences is to be opened up by the non-psychological structural understanding of the conceptual in terms of relations of material incompatibility and so consequence. Hegel's term for what I've been calling material incompatibility is determinate negation, bestimmte Negation. His term for what I've been calling material consequence is mediation, Vermittlung, after the role of the middle term in classical syllogistic inference. The first is the more fundamental concept for Hegel, perhaps in part because, as I just argued, wherever there are relations of incompatibility, there will be relations of consequence. Hegel often contrasts determinate negation, material incompatibility, with what he calls formal or abstract negation, logical inconsistency. Square is a, not the, determinate negation of circular, where not circular is the, not a, formal negation of it. These are Aristotelian contraries rather than contradictories. We're in a position to see that the choice of the term determinate to mark this difference between two kinds of negation is motivated by Hegel's view that it's just relations of determinate negation in virtue of which anything is determinate at all. This is as true of thoughts as it is of things, of discursive commitments on the subjective side of cognitive activity, no less than of facts on the side of objective reality the subject knows of and acts on. That's why, though the conception is at base non-psychological, Hegel's meta-concept of the conceptual does also apply to psychological states and processes. Thinkings and believings, too, count as determinately, and so conceptually contentful, in virtue of standing to other possible thinkings and believings in relations of material incompatibility and consequence. But are subjective commitments conceptually contentful in the same sense that objective facts are, even on Hegel's definition? When we say that being pure copper and being an electrical insulator are materially incompatible, we mean that it's physically, not logically, impossible that one and the same object at one and the same time has both properties. But when we say that the commitment to A's being pure copper and to A's being an electrical insulator are materially incompatible, we do not mean that it's impossible for one and the same subject at one and the same time to undertake both commitments. We mean rather that one ought not to do so. That ought has the practical significance that violating it means that one is subject to adverse normative assessment, that any subject with two commitments that are materially incompatible in this sense is obliged to do something, to relinquish or modify at least one of them so as to repair the inappropriate situation. But it's still entirely possible for a subject to find itself in that inappropriate normative situation. And that's to say that the relations of material incompatibility and consequence, in virtue of which objective facts and properties are determinate, are alethic modal relations, a matter of what is conditionally possible or impossible and necessary. The relations of material incompatibility and consequence, in virtue of which the commitments undertaken and predicates applied by discursive subjects are determinate, are deontic normative relations, a matter of what one is conditionally entitled and committed to. We may think of these alethic and deontic modalities, if we like, but they're still very different modalities. Hegel is writing downstream from Kant's use of necessity, Notwendigkeit, as a genus covering both cases. Notwendig, for Kant, means according to a rule. He can accordingly see what he called natural necessity and practical necessity as species of one genus. They correspond to different uses of the English word must, for instance. Nonetheless, these are very different modalities, substantially different senses of necessary or of must. The worry accordingly arises that two quite distinct phenomena are being run together, and that the attempted assimilation consists of nothing more than the indiscriminate use of the same verbal label, conceptual. Now, one of the meta-commitments for which I claimed Kant's authority is that to be intelligible, in a successor sense to Descartes, is to be conceptually structured, or what on this broadly structuralist functionalist account of content amounts to the same thing, conceptually contentful. Once again, following Kant, Hegel understands understanding, and so intelligibility, in ultimately pragmatic terms, as a matter of what one must be able practically to do to count as exercising such understanding. What one must do to count thereby as grasping or understanding the conceptual content of a discursive commitment one has undertaken, is to be sensitive in practice to the normative obligations it involves. And that means acknowledging commitments that are its consequences and rejecting those that are incompatible with it. Well, what about the intelligibility of objective states of affairs, which are conceptually contentful in virtue of the alethic modal connections of incompatibility and consequence they stand into other such states of affairs, rather than the deontic normative relations that articulate the conceptual content of corresponding discursive commitments? The key point, I think, is that what one needs to do in order thereby to count as practically taking or treating two objective states of affairs as alethically incompatible is precisely to acknowledge that if one finds oneself with the corresponding commitments, one is deontically obliged to reject or reform at least one of them. And what one needs to do in order thereby to count as practically taking or treating one objective state of affairs as a necessary, lawful consequence of another is to acknowledge the corresponding commitment to one as a consequence of the corresponding commitment to the other. Here, corresponding commitments are those whose deontic normative conceptual relations track the alethic modal conceptual relations of the objective states of affairs. Isomorphism between deontic normative conceptual relations of incompatibility and consequence among commitments and alethic modal relations of incompatibility and consequence among states of affairs determines how one takes things objectively to be. Practically acquiring and altering one's commitments in accordance with a certain set of deontic norms of incompatibility and consequence is taking the objective alethic modal relations, articulating the conceptual contents of states of affairs, to be the isomorphic ones. Because of these relations, normatively acknowledging a commitment with a certain conceptual content is taking it that things objectively are thus and so. That is, it is taking a certain fact to obtain. And that's to say that in immediately grasping the deontic normative conceptual content of a commitment, one is grasping it as the appearance of a fact whose content is articulated by the corresponding, that is, isomorphic, alethic modal relations of incompatibility and consequence. This is how the mode of presentation condition is satisfied in this sort of two-stage representational model, while giving up a strong distinction of intelligibility. And the rational constraint condition is satisfied because if the subject is asked why, that is, for what reason one is obliged to give up a commitment to Q of A upon acknowledging a commitment to P of A, something we express explicitly by the use of deontic normative vocabulary, the canonical form of a responsive answer is because it's impossible for anything to exhibit both properties of P and Q, namely something expressible explicitly by the use of alethic modal vocabulary. The genuine knowledge condition is satisfied on this model in the sense that it's not semantically precluded by the model that epistemic commitment to isomorphism of the subjective norms of incompatibility and consequence and the objective modal facts, which is implicit in the semantic relation between them, should hold objectively, at least locally and temporarily. And the model also makes sense of the possibility of error. For following Kant, it construes the representation relation in normative terms. In manipulating commitments according to a definite set of conceptual norms, that is, deontic relations of incompatibility and consequence, one is committing oneself to the objective modal facts, to the alethic relations of incompatibility and consequence being a certain way, as well as to the ground-level empirical determinate facts they articulate as being as one takes them to be. And the model also says what must be the case for that isomorphism relation to fail to hold in fact. Then one has gotten the facts wrong, perhaps including the facts about what concepts articulate the objective world. Well, in this lecture, I've aimed to do 6 things. To demarcate explicitly the exact range of epistemological theories, epitomized by those of Descartes and Kant, that fall within the target area of Hegel's criticism. To set out clearly the objection that he's making to theories of that kind, in a way that does not make his argument obviously miss its mark. To formulate Hegel's criteria of adequacy for a theory that would not be subject to that objection, which he's implicitly putting in play. More positively, to lay out the non-psychological conception of the conceptual that will form the backbone of Hegel's response, even though that conception is not officially introduced in the introduction itself, but must wait for the opening chapters of the consciousness section. To sketch the general outlines of an epistemological and semantic approach based on that conception of the conceptual, and finally to indicate how such an approach might satisfy the criteria of adequacy for a theory that's not subject to Hegel's objection. In the next lecture, I look more closely at the account of representation that I take Hegel to construct out of the elements put in play by this discussion. Thank you.
So we have a bit time for discussion. Please, if you have questions.